Adam Connor was the head of Facebook's first DC office and was responsible for explaining to lawmakers how Facebook worked and for advocating policy changes on behalf of Facebook. After leaving Facebook, Adam joined Brigade, a startup focused on civic engagement. Most recently, Adam has worked as the first DC employee for Slack, a startup focused on project coordination and communication. Adam, thanks for speaking with us.
Happy to be here.
Great. All right, so starting off, you spent a lot of time educating policymakers about technology. What were some of the biggest challenges you had in explaining new technologies to politicians?
You know, all new technologies kind of operate in a curve, essentially, which is, you have these early adopters. That's what gets certain people excited, people who are predisposed to want to try something new because they like that energy and excitement. And then it's a matter of once you get enough of those, there's the kind of first wave of people who, maybe they're the first ones who want to get the new smartphone or the first ones who want to try the new app after it's kind of been released. And those are the two audiences that are usually pretty easy to convince to try something new. But the vast majority of people, I don't like to call them users, the vast majority of people aren't people that want to change everything they do every day. They want to understand that what they're using is going to benefit them. They want to understand how it works and how they can integrate it into their lives. And so much of, particularly with busy people like government officials or elected officials or political candidates, was about having them see the advantages of using new tools, how it could benefit them, and how it wasn't as mythical or hard as they might have imagined it to be, that a lot of these tools were relatively simple to understand if you took kind of a step back from all the hype and really just looked at, here is something that allows you to connect with more constituents. Here is something that allows you to communicate with people you were trying to talk to. So a lot of it was convincing them that it was not as complicated as they might have been worried it had been, and focused more on what actually it did, and our tools did, and how it would benefit them.
Did you find that there were some policymakers that were more on the early adopter side and others that took a little bit longer maybe to adopt new technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that was most interesting about how policymakers adopt technology is you would presume that it is age-based. So maybe a younger person would be more inclined to try something than an older person. But what I found was it was really all about the kind of willingness of that individual to try new things. So very famously, John Dingell, who retired as one of the oldest members of Congress, we used to wait in line for iPhones and really was excited about new technology. And some of the younger members, particularly ones who maybe had in Congress, for instance, had never run a particularly competitive race, they were relatively comfortable in their seats, had less motivation to try new things, to want to innovate. So you could see folks like Chuck Grassley, who's an avid Twitter user, and misspellings and all, who's an older American, and using these technologies, which is, I think, what we would hope for as we kind of enter the mainstream for a lot of these things.
So in addition to educating policymakers, you also advocated for policy changes. What would you consider some of the most significant policy changes or legislative achievements that you've had a part in influencing?
I think it goes back to your initial question, which was, what was education like? Even before there is legislation or regulation to discuss, there has to be an education. It is important for people to better understand these new technologies, which can be complicated at times, and they can have lots of ripple effects. So a lot of what we did in the early days of Facebook was coming in, explaining how things worked, dispelling some of the myths, particularly if maybe somebody wasn't using our product, and having them at least have a more accurate frame of reference when they had regulatory or legal discussions. The way I like to say it was fine to yell at us if you wanted to yell at us for something we were doing, but I spent a disproportionate amount of time being yelled at for stuff we weren't doing. And so we always like to say that if we educated you, if you used our product, you would at least have a sense of what actually it did and what your concerns might be, as opposed to if you didn't use our product, if you read something sensational, maybe a headline or a tweet, and you kind of presume that to be true. So a lot of this is really about education first on these new technologies, and then understanding its impact, and then saying where do we think it is appropriate to have these discussions, whether it's committee hearings or regulation or legislation.
So were there any specific regulatory changes or policy changes that had to be made in order to incorporate new technologies?
You know, generally there's not been a tremendous amount of legislative change when it comes to new technologies because they're still trying to get their hands around it. There were a tremendous amount of hearings about these kind of things. And hearings are really the tool that Congress, for instance, uses to explore new issues, to bring in multiple sides of a discussion in order to kind of better facilitate that. You know, certainly on the what we call the agency side or the executive side, there were actions taken by states attorneys general, by the US FTC and others that we worked with on a kind of more case-by-case basis. But, you know, when it comes to legislation, and you've seen this, there hasn't been a ton in this space in the last decade. I think that might change in the future, but a lot of this has been first about educating, and now certainly there's the conversation about impact. Now that these tech platforms like Facebook have grown relatively large, the conversation has shifted to impact, and with impact comes questions about what steps government may take. So that is the phase in which we find ourselves now, whereas when I was there from 2007 onward, it was much more about the education phase.
After leaving Facebook, you worked at Brigade, and you said you focused on civic technology. What does that mean?
You know, civic tech is a phrase that gets thrown around to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Generally, it's about an ecosystem that is meant to engage in our kind of civic dialogue or civic responsibilities. This can be anything from going to a town hall meeting, to writing your congressperson, to voting, to making sure that you are able to communicate with your local elected officials or government agencies. So there's a lot of different things that we call civic engagement. In particular, Brigade, we focused on two things. One was engaging people to kind of take positions on issues they believed in, and then giving them scaled and easy to use smartphone solutions to take further actions on this. So you might say that gun control is a position that's important to you, and this is how you feel about it. And we would say, great, based on that information, here are some organizations you could follow or join. Here are some actions they'd like you to take to move this ball forward. So, that was the piece that we focused on at Brigade. When I was at Facebook, we focused on other parts like getting people to know where they could go look up their polling place on election day, or telling their friends they had voted. Other organizations work on any range of spectrums, but at Brigade, we really focused first on trying to engage folks in this civic piece of online activity, which is also an important piece of offline activity.
So you mentioned that when you were at Facebook, you worked on some civic engagement projects, but Facebook's a for-profit company, and while we might like that they do those things, what was the incentive within Facebook to take on those kinds of projects?
Sure. I think there was a couple of incentives for why companies, private companies, or kind of corporations engage in civic activity. One of them is that people's lives are multifaceted, and we believe that civic engagement is a huge part of people's lives. People talk about politics, they talk about elections, they increasingly represent their views about that online, as we've learned over the last couple of years. So that is something that was what our users and our people were doing. The other that was great about elections in the United States, for instance, on the national level, is it is an activity that a large portion of the country can participate in on a certain day and time. And if you think about the whole country, there are very few activities that you can participate in at a certain time and place. So we can all watch the Super Bowl, and for 2 hours we can be watching TV, but that's a passive thing. Whereas a large portion of the country can go to the polls on election day. They can cast a vote. They can tell their friends they vote. They can see who got elected. So it is one of the unique things that is contained that allows people to take action and participate and view. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a great opportunity for civic engagement. And it's something that is harder to do. For instance, you could call your congressperson any day of the week, right? You can call them, but you can only vote on election day. So it was really about harnessing the opportunities where there was an action that many people could take.
A lot of those projects were relatively uncontroversial, right? Everyone can get behind wanting to have more voting. But more recently, some of the challenges to Facebook have been like being inside of an echo chamber or making sure to screen their advertisements more carefully. What incentive do you think Facebook has now to do things that might not be as positively reflective or could actually cut into their revenue?
I mean, I think that there's two things to answer your question. One is, what are the incentives? I think the conversation since the end of election 2016 has not been a positive one for social media companies and technology companies. And I think that it is certainly something, as I think Mark Zuckerberg has said in one of his recent investor calls, that is going to require an investment, but is essential the continuing survival and health of the business. And so there's a short-term perspective, but then there's a longer-term perspective. And I think the conversation is important for them to try and regain trust as best they can with users by taking the steps that they can take that are within their powers as companies and organizations. I think certainly for some of the broader things like election interference from nation states or disguised nation states, that is something that the companies alone can't shoulder by themselves, and certainly requires a national response or a transnational response from institutions. And I think, unfortunately, we've seen that be lacking due to, I think, maybe lack of prioritization among the administration. To the question of echo chambers, it's an important one, and it's one that is not solely their responsibility, which is, I think, an unpopular answer sometimes. But social media is a reflection of two things: our existing real-world relationships and the kind of content we want to engage in. And so it is hard sometimes for people to want to eat their vegetables, right? It's easier to eat a cookie. And we have to think long and hard, not just about defaults and incentives and ways we can use algorithms to incentivize this, but there is a level of personal responsibility too, to make sure that we are trying to engage in the healthiest kind of civil dialogue that we choose to engage in, as opposed to defaulting, I think, to our baser instincts. And these companies may make it easier for people to take abhorrent actions like death threats or things online, but they're not the reason they're doing it. That's still individuals taking action. And so it really is a broader discussion about collective action and collective responsibility as well.
So I'll start off about the more action being warranted at the national level. What do you think that kind of action would look like? And do you think there's more regulations maybe necessary for technology companies that have this platform nowadays?
It is hard for me to say that regulation is the only thing. I think it is certainly a possibility. But if you look at some of the breakdowns that happen with intelligence sharing, with early warning, with information sharing, those aren't things that those are things that could have happened in both administrations. The previous one and the current one haven't happened or have not been a priority. And so while there may be regulations on things like foreign advertising or other things, there's a tremendous amount that's already on the books that's not being done that should certainly be a first priority, particularly since we are just months away from our next national election. The midterms are coming up. So I think it is an important discussion. I think there is a second discussion, in addition to doing all the things we should be doing that are already in the books, about what makes sense in the 21st century around both foreign interference, but then broader discussions around this.
And then outside of kind of government action, do you think there's anything that we as a user base can do to encourage Facebook maybe to be more civically responsible?
Sure. I think that civically responsible is, again, a reflection of its users as well. And this doesn't just go for Facebook, it goes for kind of all the tools you use. And part of this, the argument that companies make is that they're giving users what they are asking for, that what users are demonstrating they want with their clicks, with their eyeballs. And there are very important defaults and ways that you can broaden that perspective or have other things. But there's also a discussion about what it is we as users want. I think there is a larger discussion ideologically about what is the sense of agency that we have as individuals, right? Like to which extent are we making our own choices, and to which extent are we being funneled towards them by the defaults? And I think it is not one answer or the other, it is both. But that's a tough conversation to have because it requires us thinking a little bit about ourselves as much as we think about these technologies.
Moving on to something about where they're more platform companies nowadays. So they also kind of create some of their own media and their own content. Do you think there's additional legislation or regulation that's required now that they've taken on this different platform media company-esque role that's in contrast to their previous technology company role?
I think the term platform gets thrown around to be a very wide encompassing thing. You just used it in the context of a media company. It's not clear to me NBC News, for instance, would consider themselves to be a media company, right? Or a media platform. Platform is a phrase that has a distinct set of implications in Silicon Valley, for instance. These are APIs that developers can build on to build tools, and becomes a much more nebulous piece when we start talking about media, and in particular, maybe how we have traditionally viewed the media in this country from a both legal and regulatory space. So I think that it is an interesting discussion. I think there's probably more nuance for the terms that need to be happening because it's almost like two different conversations in that sense. Because someone from the tech world hears the word platform and they think APIs. Somebody from the non-tech world hears platform and they think it's it's a soapbox on which people can stand. I haven't seen a lot of people as concerned about the content companies themselves are creating. That seems to have been a much more ancillary concern as opposed to independent press. I think it's a much more important conversation about how independent media, so media organizations like the New York Times or Fox News or whatever it might be, that relies on these platforms for distribution to their audience, have to have a discussion about that relationship. And that is a little more fraught because technology is such a driver of traffic, but they can also take it away. So that's where I think a much more interesting conversation is. I'm not sure people's top concerns are around actual content being generated by these actual companies. I think it's more about the role of how they control kind of the distribution.
You mentioned earlier the New York Times and Fox News. I would classify those kind of as the older media generation. Do you think there's anything that they should be doing to adapt to new technology platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, to be able to reach a wider audience?
This is certainly, I don't pretend to be a media or news expert, but what you see now is a realignment in reaction to the power that Google and Facebook and Twitter have over news distribution. And you see them moving away from some of the earlier bets they made that had very tightly yoked themselves and their livelihoods to these platforms. And so one of the benefits, for instance, of the New York Times building up a subscriber base of people who pay them is that they don't need to be solely reliant on traffic from one of these websites. And so when a dial is turned on in an algorithm and traffic goes down, they still have a sustainable base for them to continue and be financially viable. Whereas obviously, websites you've heard of maybe that did viral videos, or viral headlines have suffered as things have been tweaked. So I think certainly that it is a conversation about financial viability and survivability that is beyond just these platforms, because these platforms are also a positive and that they can increase distribution, and a negative in that they take some of the agency away from them.
So do you think it's at all problematic how much control that these technology companies now have over the distribution of ideas? And do you think there's anything that needs to be changed to make sure that distribution is more equitable maybe, or less, like, to prevent against future bias potentially?
I think that's a good conversation to have. I don't know, honestly. I mean, I think it ignores the fact, for instance, that news companies gave up this content to them for free, and now there's they gave up some of their negotiating power in this context, and you see them attempting to get it back, for instance, with the antitrust exemption that the news organizations are trying to do to negotiate. I think it is a broader conversation. It's also a conversation about how we have algorithms that are individualized, but also, kind of what we deem to be healthy. And I think that is a place where you get into a lot of philosophical differences. Is it your idea of what is a healthy media consumption, or is it my idea? Or how do we template these things? And so I don't know the answer to that. I think it's an important discussion to have. I think it is important to remember as well that we tend to have, as much as we talk about silos when it comes to echo chambers or filter bubbles or within the platforms, these policy solutions often come from that kind of echo chamber as well. And it's important to think about what we think about is important for all consumers and the individual as well.
Okay. So we kind of touched on this idea that the technology companies now have a lot of power. But they also have kind of people in DC whose job it is to advocate on behalf of those companies. Do you think it's all concerning that the education of policymakers could become more advocating on behalf of large tech companies to increase their power?
I mean, I don't see that as anything that's particularly different from any other industry in this country. We know all sorts of industries have corporate power and use it in Washington, D.C. I think, if anything, it becomes a more traditional story with all of the pros and cons of larger corporations that these have become. Is there a difference because these are technology platforms that control this? I think certainly there's a concern and a question, but it is, let's not pretend that there have never been corporations that went to Washington, D.C. to exercise influence, right? That would just be not true. And so I think it is, as these are becoming large parts of our economy, the top 5 publicly traded companies by market capitalization are all American tech companies right now. I don't think it's a particular surprise that they are exercising the influence that large organizations have always tried to exercise over governments both here and around the world.
So there are other companies that have had this influence in the past, And a lot of times that was considered problematic as well. So especially considering that technology companies are this much larger in some senses than the other companies in the past.
Are they though?
Well, a lot of the companies these days are, I would argue, at least if not by market cap larger, at the very least more integrated, I would say, in everyday lives.
Okay.
So do you think that's at all concerning?
I mean, so there's two parts to that. I think I would quibble in the fact that these are maybe more integrated into your everyday life. If you drive a car, an oil company is very integrated into your life.
Yeah.
If you pay for things with money, the U.S. financial system is very integrated into your everyday life. So I think let's not diminish the role that they play. Obviously, they play a huge and integral part in life. There are a lot of large sectors that also play an integral part of your everyday life, right? So I think that the concern that these are completely unique is probably a little maybe not quite what I would say there. I think there's plenty of industries that are like that. And I think, yes, I think that's absolutely a conversation that we should be having, and we have avenues to have that conversation. We have entities at the federal, state, and local level who can have these conversations, regulatory bodies, legislative bodies, and I think what we have seen is that these conversations had been stalled in the past or non-existent. They are now roaring to the forefront. And it is something that is certainly capturing attention and concern. And where that happens, policymakers and regulators are starting to take a notice. I do think it is unusual that the position tech has had over the last few years is unusual, which is that it's very rare to be very large, have a lot of money, be very powerful, and be really loved. And I think it is possible that, like other industries, they may keep some of those parts, but they might not be as beloved or as popular as they have been. And I think that is a shift that portends a lot of different possibilities, like legislation, like regulation.
So you have worked as someone who's been in the DC offices. What do you think companies now like Facebook or Google, Amazon, what do you think that their main focus is as in their DC offices?
You've talked about how big these companies are now, how integrated they are to their lives. I think by the dent of that, they now have to have people that do all sorts of different things, everything from Congress to the executive branch to safety to security to state and local. So there's so many different things that they touch now. They have to have a lot of different people, and I think that's just a consequence of being these larger entities that focus on so many different things. I think at the end of the day, obviously, issues that are core to the business, around legislation of the internet, around access to things, around globally competitive markets are certainly their top priorities. But when they did fewer things, there were fewer things we had to work on, right? Now that there were a lot of things, it requires more people to focus on a lot of different things. And so, the key priorities are obviously still the same. What keeps the kind of the company running and the lights on. But in the past there were not data centers across the world for these companies, and now there are, and they have to think about that. They were, they literally lay cables undersea, connect the internet to the world. Now they have to think about that. They're flying drones in the sky, which means they need to have people who do aviation policy. They're putting cars on the road. So there's so many different things they touch, and every new industry just begets more people because it touches more in different things.
At the same time that the technology companies are adjusting to the change, so too are policymakers, and one could argue they've been a little bit slow on that. Do you think there's any way that policymakers can better adapt to technological changes in the future?
I think that part of it is certainly a lack of expertise on subject technical matters in the House and the Senate, for instance, in the United States. There are some programs underway to help improve that. Folks like the Tech Congress Fellowship, which aims to bring technologists into congressional offices to help bolster their understanding of things like engineering and science related topics, cybersecurity, that sort of thing. So I do think there are efforts underway that will help that, and I think certainly a focus on staffers who understand that is a really critical piece of this. And the other is, I think quite frankly, the revolution has caught up to some extent with the day-to-day experience, which is that every lawmaker I know has a smartphone, and they understand how it works, and they can start to visualize some of the more complicated policy implications because they can see this thing on their device every day, and they're smart people, and they start to realize some of the context. That is not to say they realize all of the context, but as compared to where things were on desktop computers 10 years ago, having a computer in your hand that everyone has changed the way they start to think about some of these things.
And finally, do you think there's anything that we can do to educate ourselves more on technology policy or even get involved in technology policy?
So that's a great question. One of the things that I think is a very strong net positive of the internet is it gives people access to information and experts that they have not had before. So as I talked about my study group a lot, there is now an access if you're interested in technology and in the business of tech companies and the policy implications, through podcasts, through Twitter, through Medium posts, through these organizations, you can learn as much as some of the experts sitting in think tanks in Washington or on campuses here. And so, all it takes is a little bit of interest to dive deep into it, and you can get a very great education on how to kind of follow these things. There are a lot of experts who are on these sites and providing their insights regularly. So I really encourage people, when you have an agenda, it is not that in the past it might have been much more difficult. You might have had to go to a library or tune into one program once a week. There is a plethora of information out there. Not all of it's good, but as you absorb it, you can start to tell, okay, these people really get it. They're thinking about the future. They might have different perspectives than me, obviously, which I encourage. And it's just a great opportunity for us to be able to better inform ourselves to the extent that we can. And I think that'll be our challenge is, will we rise to the extent of informing ourselves or helping inform ourselves as we kind of navigate through this new world?
Great. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Good. This has been an interview with Adam Connor. For more articles, please visit www.harvardpolitics.com.